Welcome to the AI Policy Podcast, a podcast by the Wadhwani AI Center at CSIS. I'm Gregory C. Allen.
And I'm Andrew Schwartz.
Join us as we dive into the world of AI policy, where we will discuss the implications of this transformative technology and what governments around the world are doing about it.
Welcome to our first news roundup of 2025 on the AI Policy Podcast. I'm Brielle Hill, joined today by Greg Allen, the director of the Wadhwani AI Center here at CSIS, and a friend and colleague of CSIS, Lennart Heim from RAND. The first half of today's episode was going to discuss all of the major updates coming out of the second Trump administration as they've come out swinging on AI in just its first week. In the second half of this episode, we're going to invite Lennart to chat with us about OpenAI's $500 billion announcement of Stargate, updates on AGI timelines from tech CEOs, big news coming out of China's leading AI frontier model lab, DeepSeek. Let's just dive right in. Greg, on January 20th, President Donald Trump repealed the Biden administration's executive order on safe, secure, and trustworthy development and use of artificial intelligence. So what is the actual impact of this move?
So I think there's a bunch of things here. Number one, this is Donald Trump making good on his promise, which was stated explicitly in the Republican Party platform during the campaign, that they're going to repeal this executive order. I think one big question is, what is left to repeal? Because the executive order gave a lot of deadlines for its work. You know, this had to happen by 90 days. This had to happen by 180 days. This had to happen by 270 days. And almost all of those deadlines have come and gone and been implemented. The Biden administration was really cracking the whip on implementation of this executive order. And so a lot of those do-outs have already come out. So when you repeal the executive order, you know, you're sort of saying like, you shouldn't have done that thing that you already did. What I'm pointing out here is a lot of the downstream implementation of the executive order does not inherently get repealed just because you repealed the executive order. To just give you one example, the executive order required every federal agency, pretty much, or at least all the big departments, to create chief AI officers. There is a chief AI officer at the Department of Energy now. There is a chief AI officer at the Department of State now, et cetera, et cetera. All those people aren't fired just because you repealed the executive order. If you want to fire them, my advice, by the way, is don't. But if you wanted to fire them, you have to do something beyond just repealing this executive order. There's some big stuff on AI safety that does not end just because you repeal the executive order. So, for example, the executive order gave the United States federal government authority by invoking the Defense Production Act to say that the frontier AI labs, think OpenAI, think Anthropic, et cetera, had to share transparently with the United States government information regarding their safety testing on their leading models. So that authority, it directed the United States federal government to sort of prepare to exercise that authority, and the notice of proposed rulemaking already came out. Now, there is this second thing that hasn't come out, which is the interim final rule, which means that the rules are not actually in effect. They did not come out through the Bureau of Industry and Security, which is going to be the implementing agency in this case. But this is an example where if the United States federal government wants to leverage that authority, they can still do so. Now, this is an example, however, where inaction means that something does not happen, right? We talked before on the last podcast about how in the case of the AI diffusion rule, the Trump administration has to actively take measures to stop the implementation of that rule. They can't just do nothing and it goes away. It's the reverse in this case. If the Trump administration does nothing with regards to this sort of mandatory not just doing the safety testing, which in large part all the frontier AI labs are already doing, but sharing that data with the government, the Trump administration is actually going to have to move on that. I think, number one, they might not want to. As we've heard from folks like Mark Andreessen, who's really been a part of the thought leadership of the Trump administration when it comes to AI regulation, he had a quote that I think is worth providing here. The quote, "The idea that we're going to deliberately hamstring ourselves through onerous regulations while the rest of the world lights up on this and while China lights up on this," that's what he was worried about. In this case, however, the companies have sort of said they like the partnership that they have with the AI Safety Institute. They like that the government is this sort of independent third party who they have. And they really, really like the fact that it gives the United States a talking point as it's negotiating with Europe and saying, hey, Europe, you're proposing to regulate American AI companies in all these ways that we view as draconian and regulatory overreach. And our rebuttal to that can either be nothing, or it can be the AI Safety Institute, this other sort of transparency measures, et cetera, et cetera. So I think that the Trump administration might find stuff that they like in there, but it's certainly no guarantee that that's going to be the case. One other thing or maybe two other things that I think are worth pointing out here. Kara Frederick, who was formerly the head of tech policy at the Heritage Foundation, but now has been made a special assistant to the president with a focus on technology policy and national security policy. We actually just had her at CSIS not that long ago before she joined the administration. And she said, quote, guardrails matter. And I don't think the Wild West has worked out in other areas of the tech space, and I don't think it will necessarily work out with AI absent guardrails. But the word AI safety has been poisoned. It is radioactive in some very conservative circles. So I think that's a very reasonable take. So I think there's the question of like, when they hear AI safety, there are parts of the Republican policy community that immediately jump to censorship on social media, that think about what happened with the Gemini launch of Google, where it was generating images of, a rainbow of human races, but they were all Nazis. And so doing stuff that was like historically inaccurate and oddly offensive as it was trying to be inoffensive. And so this is what they think about when they think about that term AI safety. But when they think about guardrails, they see some stuff that is interesting and that they like it. The final thing that's worth pointing out here is the AI Safety Institute itself does not relate to the AI executive order. You abolish the AI executive order, the AI Safety Institute sticks around. So if the Trump administration wants to get rid of the AI Safety Institute, which I don't think they necessarily do, although Senator Ted Cruz, has expressed some desire to do so, there's this other thing going on in Congress, which is a bipartisan piece of legislation co-sponsored by Senator Maria Cantwell and Todd Young. And it has already passed the Senate Commerce, Science, and Transportation Committee last year and is now, awaiting consideration by the full Senate. So I think there is momentum in Congress. There is momentum in industry for certain parts of the ideas that were embodied in the executive order around guardrails, around protecting America from various threats that AI might present. But I do think that anything that is perceived to have even the slightest whiff of woke ideology, that stuff is gone. And to the extent that repealing the AI executive order did not get rid of it, I think they're going to continue pressing to get rid of it.
So it sounds to me like business is continuing as usual at this point until more information comes from the Trump administration?
Yeah, I think a lot of this has to continue with implementation. And this is the case, I think, in a lot of executive orders. It's one thing to pass an executive order. It's another thing to have an aggressive White House driving implementation by all of the various federal agencies of that. That is what the Biden administration did with respect to this executive order. And so a lot of that work is in place. And if the Trump administration wants to go undo some of that work, there's more than just repealing the executive order that they would have to go do.
So how are the key AI companies talking about this right now?
So I think right now, most of the companies perceive correctly that Donald Trump is in a pretty strong position politically in the United States federal government. He has a very motivated Republican Party that in many domains of policy, not every domain of policy, but in many domains of policy, really doesn't want to get on his bad side, really doesn't want to disrupt his agenda. So the companies, many of which had their CEOs attending Trump's inauguration, prominently seated. There was one photo that I thought was really remarkable where you had a bunch of tech CEOs literally sitting in front of the cabinet secretary nominees. So they had better seats than the cabinet secretaries, which I thought was a remarkable message to send. And all of these companies are, trying to find a way to stay on Donald Trump's good side. So while they have their policy preferences, A lot of them, for example, have gone on the record saying they want the AI Safety Institute to continue. I think where they disagree with Trump, they will likely say that softly and privately. And where they agree with Trump, they will say that loudly and publicly.
Okay, so on the same day, day one, that Trump repealed the AI executive order, he also issued a memorandum titled America First Trade Policy. What does this have to do with AI?
Yeah, so as you said, we've got a whirlwind of policy coming out of the White House. One way that somebody described it to me is if you think the first 100 days, which is like a classic way of framing a new presidential administration, you're too slow. You should really be thinking about the first 100 hours. And boy, did a lot happen in the first
true.
It was very true. There was just a whirlwind, as you said, of policymaking coming out. And a lot of that had to deal with AI, either directly or indirectly. So in the case of this America First trade policy, there's one that deals with re-examining export controls. And I think this language is worth quoting at length. So, quote, "The Secretary of State and the Secretary of Commerce shall review the United States export control system and advise on modifications in light of developments involving strategic adversaries or geopolitical rivals, as well as all other relevant national security and global considerations. Specifically, the Secretary of State and the Secretary of Commerce shall assess and make recommendations regarding how to maintain, obtain, and enhance our nation's technological edge and how to identify and eliminate loopholes in existing export controls." So I want to take a victory lap here on some of the stuff that I've said on this podcast in the past. Number one, Senator Marco Rubio. He was he's no longer a senator. For the presumptive Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, he was very loud on export controls while he was a United States senator. And I think what this shows is, yes, he absolutely wants to be in the driver's seat alongside the Secretary of Commerce in driving export control policy in this forthcoming administration. I mean, it kind of has to be that way because the State Department is in charge of the weapons and munitions export control lists. The Commerce Department is in charge of the dual-use export control list. But when you say, this language in there, enhance our nation's technological edge and how to identify and eliminate loopholes in existing export controls, that's exactly the kind of thing that Marco Rubio was talking about while he was on Capitol Hill. And so I expect them to re-examine export controls, but it doesn't say, you're not seeing the same kind of language that you see on AI regulation. It doesn't talk about overreach. It doesn't talk about how export controls have harmed our industry. So it would be easy to sort of, read too much into this because they could change their minds. But so far, they're sending signals that they want to continue the Biden administration's approach and perhaps even strengthen the Biden administration's approach, which I think is really interesting. One thing that was also interesting in there is re-examining the executive order on outbound investment. This one has been really controversial on Capitol Hill. And you've seen former Republican members of Congress, had actually taken steps to try and weaken what the Biden administration had done in terms of outbound investments into Chinese technology companies, for example. So the question here, the language, says that they're going to examine what the Biden administration did to examine whether it, quote, includes sufficient controls to address national security threats. So at least in the tone they're taking, in this executive order, it says that they're looking to go stronger, not to go softer.
So we've talked a little bit about the state side of things and Marco Rubio, but what do we know about President Trump's appointees in the Department of Commerce and their views on AI and semiconductor export controls?
So we now have the name for who is the nominee to be the undersecretary in charge of the Bureau of Industry and Security. That is Jeffrey Kessler. So Jeffrey Kessler, previously was a lawyer in a major law firm that works on export control stuff. But before that, he was the Assistant Secretary for Enforcement and Compliance during Trump's first term. And as we've said, here on this podcast, most of the moves that the Biden administration took on export controls have antecedents in the first Trump administration, right? Chip export controls in their modern form began in the first Trump administration with the controls on ZTE and Huawei. And semiconductor manufacturing equipment controls began in the first Trump administration with the deal they negotiated with the Dutch government to restrict EUV exports to China, and also the export controls put on SMIC in December of 2020. So that to me signals, again, a strong approach on export controls. Now, Jeff Kessler's boss is going to be Howard Lutnick, assuming he, successfully passes Senate confirmation. So Lutnick is viewed in general as a China hawk, but I don't think we have a statement on the record from him about what he thinks about the Biden administration's approach to export controls on semiconductors and AI-related technology. So that's a confirmation hearing I cannot wait to watch. I think we're going to learn an awful lot about the likely direction of Trump administration policy.
Okay, well, let's move on. 3 days later, on January 23rd, President Trump issued an executive order on AI titled Removing Barriers to American Leadership in Artificial Intelligence. It's kind of a short EO, but what can you tell us about this EO?
Yes, so I think what's interesting is, number one, you're right. It is a very short EO. But what it says as its goal, which I think is kind of understood and was clear that this was going to be the Trump administration's goal writ large, is to ensure United States leadership. But one of the things it says explicitly is, quote, to maintain this leadership, we must develop AI systems that are free from ideological bias or engineered social agendas. So that, again, goes back to what I was saying before. Anything that has a whiff of woke ideology or diversity, equity, inclusion type of stuff, that's what they want to get rid of. Some people put that in the AI safety bucket. Some people put that in a separate bucket and don't call it AI safety. But that is clearly the part that the Trump administration wants to eliminate. The second thing is it actually includes, this policy statement, which I think is really interesting. Quote, it is the policy of the United States to sustain and enhance America's global AI dominance in order to promote human flourishing, economic competitiveness, and national security. Now, what's funny here is that if you're in an antitrust lawsuit, the prosecuting attorney who wants to call you a monopoly, they look for any email in the history of your company where anybody has said the word dominance. Dominance is like what the corporate lawyers are like, for the love of God, do not say the word dominance in an email or in some other kind of, record that is going to be subpoenaed someday. But here, the Trump administration, never one to be shy or to mince words, they're saying dominance is the point. That is what we're pursuing. And I think that's interesting in and of itself. But this kind of, to me, is planning to plan. Because when you get to the actual substance, Section 4, developing an artificial intelligence action plan, it says that, quote, within 180 days of this order, the assistant to the president for science technology, the special advisor for AI and crypto, that's the quote unquote AI czar, David Sachs, and the assistant to the president for national security affairs, in coordination with the assistant to the president for economic policy, the assistant to the president for domestic policy, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, that's going to be Russell Vought, who was very influential in the first Trump administration, and the heads of the executive departments and agencies shall develop and submit to the president an action plan to achieve the policy set forth in Section 2 of this order. So again, this is a plan to plan. They're getting together all the relevant folks. Notice that they didn't say, for example, that the AI czar, now czar often, you assume that person is in charge, right? You're literally referring with your term to an old monarchy. But what this is saying is that, Michael Kratsios, who's leading the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, Russ Vought, who's leading the Office of Management and Budget, Mike Waltz, who's leading the National Security Council, and the AI czar, these folks have to work together. They're the ones who have to come up with the plan. And it is not clear, at least from the language in this order, that there's like one person who is in charge over all of these different folks. It's like sort of a classic interagency process. At least to me, it looks like they're going to run on this. So this is a plan to plan, which I think to the Trump administration's credit, they were ready to go with this on day one, but it's not as though the sort of debates that have been going on in the Republican Party had been resolved to such an extent that on day one they already had that plan. Sure. So I think that's interesting. So
some of the biggest differences between this EO and the Biden administration EO includes some of the more information coming soon. We're coming out with what's the plan, the roadmap's going to be moving forward on AI, rather than here's what we have for you, here's how we're moving forward. Yeah, because there have been some really important debates that we've talked about on this podcast among different Republican Party constituencies.
and the various voices who are influential on AI policy in Republican Party circles don't always agree with each other. They did not resolve that during the campaign, but what this says is they are going to resolve that debate. We are going to have a firm position, and it's coming in not longer than 6 months.
Well, I know our team is going to be tracking that and analyzing that as that comes out and all the conversations surrounding it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think that wraps up the first part of our podcast. We're going to move on to the second part, bring in our guest superstar of the day, Lennart Heim. For those of you who may not know Lennart, if you'll just take a moment to tell us who you are.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me. Lennart Heim. I'm an information scientist at RAND, and I work on all things AI, in particular AI and compute, export controls, many similar to topics that Greg usually covers.
Yeah, so Lennart, I've been reading your work for ages. I fantasize about a world in which you also read my work. Who knows? But, you and I have been friends. We've traveled abroad together, and I've been respecting your thinking on this. And there were some big moves on topics that are near and dear to your and my heart in terms of AI compute infrastructure, the race towards artificial general intelligence, and progress in China's AI models. And so we wanted to have you on the podcast to jam with us on all of these topics. So thanks for coming by.
Okay, so on January 21st, OpenAI, SoftBank, Oracle, and UAE-backed MGX announced Stargate, which is a joint venture planning to invest up to $500 billion in U.S. money on U.S. AI infrastructure over the next 4 years. So this announcement was made at the White House alongside President Donald Trump. Greg, what do we know about Stargate and its main objectives so far?
So I think there's a bunch that's interesting in this announcement. Number one, and Larry Ellison, the executive chairman of Oracle, stated this explicitly, there's big parts of this that is not a new announcement, right? This is continuation of what was going on. Larry Ellison said the first of the data centers are already under construction in Texas, quote, each building 500,000 square feet, and there are 10 buildings currently being built, but that will expand to 20 in other locations. So all of the folks in their speeches at this event with Trump there, giving the sort of main speech, they all said, this would not have happened without you, Mr. President. But then they also said, we were already doing this. So it's worth asking ourselves, like, what specifically is new in this announcement? And I think there's a few things. Number one, there's the number, $500 billion. Trump said specifically that they had approached him and said they wanted to make this announcement, originally $100 billion, and Trump's addition to the idea was to say, make it $200 billion. And then they came back to him and said, now it's $500 billion. And I think that's kind of interesting. Noteworthy here is that it is $500 billion over the next 4 years. So they're literally saying that's what we're going to invest during the course of the first Trump administration. Another thing that's new is the involvement of SoftBank. So for folks who don't know SoftBank is a venture capital firm, but specifically, they are an incredibly well-capitalized firm that is willing to make really, really, really big dollar bets. They're almost an alternative and seen as an alternative in many cases to your company going public, right? If you need a massive infusion of capital in order to make your company work, you can either go list yourself on NASDAQ or the New York Stock Exchange and open yourself up to investors from around the world, or you can just go to SoftBank, who is so rich that they are willing to do it in and of themselves. Another big thing about SoftBank is their ties to the Middle East. They have in the past had these vision funds, which includes an awful lot of dollars from wealthy Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds. And here in this announcement, they actually included one of those Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds, the UAE-backed MGX fund. So I think the entire UAE, if you put all the sovereign wealth funds together, is $1.5 trillion. Don't quote me under oath, about that number, but it's big, big money. This is a very wealthy country. If they want to put this $500 billion up, they have the money to do it. And this is structured as a joint venture. So all of these entities are creating a new company called Stargate, and OpenAI is actually the customer of this new company. So this company is going to provide the computing resources exclusively to serve OpenAI. I think that's all, a really big deal. But there's one thing that's really interesting about this story, which is the numbers and how it might happen. So they say they're going to spend $100 billion this year. Now, for folks who made the good choice of not going to business school, which I failed to make that good choice, but there's this word called depreciation that everybody should be aware of. And it basically says if you spend a lot of money to go buy this big, expensive asset, well, it's worth a certain amount in year one. How much is it worth in year two? How much is it worth in year three, right? Everybody knows that if you go buy a car and then you try to sell it 1 year later, you'll notice that the value has dropped by 25% just in that first year. That phenomenon is depreciation. Well, the reason why this comes up in the Stargate investment is that the assets that they're buying, which is energy infrastructure, data center infrastructure, and then what goes inside those data centers, AI chips. Well, the AI chips are a big, big, big component of that investment, and they depreciate over 3 years. You've lost almost all the value of the chip just because chips are getting better at such an incredible rate after 3 years. So it's a pretty scary bet as an investor to say, okay, we're going to spend $100 billion to buy these assets that we know are going to go to zero 3 years from now. So you had better have an extraordinary 3 years if you want to justify the investment. Now, some of that stuff, like the energy infrastructure, vastly more durable, going to continue kicking out really useful value for a really long period of time. A lot of the data center infrastructure, like the cooling infrastructure, just all the real estate, et cetera, that's going to last for longer than 100 billion, longer than 1 year, 3 years. But the chips themselves depreciate really, really fast. And so I think it speaks to the confidence of these companies that we're on the cusp of some kind of extraordinary revolution, that they're willing to make these kinds of bets with these dollar figures on this timeline. But Lennart, I've been really wanting to hear your take on all of this. So what do you think?
I think what's remarkable about this one, it's explicitly building in the US. And this nicely connects to the diffusion rule, right? Diffusion rule was explicitly saying, hey, if you're like a cloud provider, an American cloud provider like Oracle, you gotta build 50% at least in the US. We also know that Oracle was quite outspoken about the diffusion rule and not really liking it, right? And there's been some recent reporting they wanted to build some big data centers in Malaysia, which they probably can't know anymore. Or maybe they're just trying to offset it. Where it's well, if we just build enough in the US, we can also build more in Malaysia.
Yeah.
Right? I think that's interesting. And the other notable aspect here is OpenAI had this exclusive agreement with Microsoft. No more. OpenAI got more friends now. So does Microsoft, right?
And notably, Microsoft CEO Satya Nadella not at that announcement.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. And then, you mentioned the 500 billion. It's the first 100 billion now, but a couple of hours later, Elon Musk was tweeting, guys, you actually don't have the money, right? So there's some ongoing debate right now. Do they actually have the money to deploy these kinds of things? How much liquid money do they actually have to do it? And this remains to be seen. Yeah,
so I think it's worth pointing out that Sam Altman responded, "You're wrong," But I do think that there's a difference between do they have a lot of money right now, which I'm confident they do. Satya Nadella, by the way, on CNBC said, "quote I'm good for my 80 billion." So he's sort of pointing out that he's a part of this deal, even though he wasn't present at the announcement. But I think what's worth pointing out is I do think this was kind of the advertising prospectus for other people who want to contribute the money. Look, we've got the backing of the American president. Look, we've said loudly and proudly we're going to do this. So if you're the head of SoftBank and you want to raise all this money, that event was very helpful to you. They've clearly got a lot of money because, as Larry Ellison said, they're already building in Texas. I would be surprised if they already had $500 billion in a bank somewhere ready for this project. But it's clear that they're going to raise jaw-dropping amounts of money, no matter what Elon Musk says. There's one other detail here that I think is really interesting in the Elon Musk tweet, which is Larry Ellison is a close personal friend of Elon Musk. They hang out at each other's, villas. They go on vacation together. They've known each other for ages. And what's so strange is that Elon Musk also used to be the very close personal friend of Larry Page, the former CEO of Google. And at least in the way Elon tells the story, the reason why they are no longer friends is literally an argument that they had about AI safety. And that Larry Page was not sufficiently, conscious of the fact that AI, poses an existential threat to humanity, and Elon Musk is obsessed with that idea. So much so that he literally, when he was the CEO of Tesla in the early years, he didn't have a house in San Francisco. He stayed at Larry Page's house almost every time. And now they're not friends anymore because of a disagreement about AI safety. Well, here there's another Larry, who's another tech billionaire, who Elon Musk maybe kind of sort of is getting ready to sever ties with over a disagreement about AI. I might be reading too much into that little Twitter dispute, but it's something that I'm going to be paying attention to.
Well, and there's been this ongoing drama of Elon Musk actually suing OpenAI right now, right? And I think everybody has been talking about the power Elon Musk has over the Trump presidency. Now we see this announcement. How's this playing out? Does it speak he's just Trump is running both trains at the same time, right?
You're right. You're right. There's three tech CEOs who Elon Musk has come to put on his enemies list, right? Because
it feels like a sitcom to some extent. Seeing this announcement was quite remarkable.
Big dollars, big personalities in AI right now.
Well, something that you also pointed out was that OpenAI is the main customer for this, or maybe the sole customer for this.
Sole customer, yeah. Exclusive customer.
Why would the UAE-backed MGX be a part of a group like this if the end goal is to sort of promote OpenAI's work?
Well, I think there's multiple things. Number one, this is not unprecedented for the UAE. UAE has a big investment in Cerebras, for example, which is an AI chip company. They compete with NVIDIA. They have sort of a different technical approach. And there are big Cerebras data centers that are owned by UAE sovereign wealth funds, and those data centers are in America right now. So it's definitely not unprecedented for the UAE to make big investments in the American tech ecosystem, including on U.S. soil types of investments. Then, connecting it to what Lennart said about the diffusion rule, which I agree is a really interesting data point here. The diffusion rule specifically says that for companies that want to be universal validated end users, which is an important distinction, to get permission to buy an awful lot of chips and go build them in other places, 50% of your computing infrastructure has to be in the United States. If you're a U.S. headquartered company. And so the UAE, I think in their heart of hearts, right, if you ask them, there's going to be no regulations whatsoever, what is your top preference? Well, I think they would say build $500 billion worth of data centers in the UAE. Sure. But the sort of reality of what other investors and other companies are willing to tolerate, and then I think very importantly, the reality of the AI diffusion rule does seem to have coalesced around, hey, we're going to invest an awful lot in the United States specifically. One question I sort of have is there a negotiating leverage, part of this story, right? Can the UAE then take that to the Trump administration and say, hey, we're going to invest X $100 billion or so in the United States government. Can we be on the Group 1 list of the diffusion rule? Wouldn't that be a nice thank you note to send us, right, after we've made all these jaw-dropping investments in the U.S. technology ecosystem? I'm, again, speculating there, but I wouldn't be surprised if that comes up in the next meeting.
So just last week, the Biden administration issued an executive order titled Advancing United States Leadership in Artificial Intelligence Infrastructure. What is the relationship between this action and the Stargate announcement? And maybe, Lennart, I know that you want to talk a little bit about creating jobs in this space.
So we saw these last executive orders and the rules on BS coming out. And we saw the diffusion rule. And the diffusion rule explicitly says, well, you please build in the US. But to build in the US, we need energy. And I think when we talk about 500 billion, you need staggering amounts of energy, right? Just doing this. We saw Microsoft wanting to activate 3 Mile Island again. And what this last executive order basically tries to do is just simplify permitting, making it easier to get access to the energy and more. And connecting it to the Stargate announcement, Trump and others explicitly said, well, it's going to create a lot of jobs, right? We're going to be building these data centers. And, well, I think that's right. We need a bunch of people building these data centers. But I think what many people forget, if you look at the square footage of such a data center and how many people actually work there per square foot, it's not that many. Right? It's if you're compared to an Amazon warehouse, it ain't that many. And notably, if you look at OpenAI's explicit mission, it is to build AGI. How do they find AGI? Doing all economically valuable tasks. So to put it in Sam Altman terms, there might be a lot of nice jobs in the meanwhile, but in the end, when you have AGI, when you guys have your explicit goal, we got to talk about the jobs again, right? Like the explicit goal is like to automate all of these kinds of things. And I think this hasn't really come through.
Yeah, I mean, just to double click on what Lennart said about the jobs, the construction of the data centers creates a lot of jobs, right? People operating construction machinery, people with a shovel or a screwdriver or whatever. That creates a lot of jobs. But the operation of the data centers, they're actually pretty heavily automated. So like the sort of jobs per, $1 million of capital investment actually ends up being low. It's a little bit of a different story on the energy side of the equation, right? Operating power plants, operating new energy grid infrastructure, that creates jobs in construction and also creates jobs at the point of operation. Your point about sort of like technology taking our jobs, I don't think they're going to make that. I don't think they're going to make that part of the announcement anytime soon. So you're right. I do think that's sort of a conversation that perhaps they will return to. But Brielle, what you talked about connecting this to the Biden administration's AI executive order, I think it's really interesting that we saw now a quote from Trump. I'd like to see federal lands opened up for data centers. I think they're going to be very important. So while I don't think it's likely that the Trump administration is ever going to endorse the Biden administration's executive order, they're clearly endorsing the ideas underlying that executive order, which is state and local permitting for new data centers, state and local permitting for energy infrastructure is a regulatory nightmare. Let's put it on federal lands where we can create softer requirements for what that all looks like. And he's clearly endorsing the ideas under like that. So again, as I said on a previous podcast, I don't think that executive order is likely to survive unmodified, but I do think the big ideas under that executive order are very, very likely to survive. Just to give you an example of what might be cut here, when the press release came out from the Biden administration, it said, quote, "We will not let America be outbuilt when it comes to the technology that will define the future, nor should we sacrifice the critical environmental standards and our shared efforts to protect clean air and clean water." Well, I think the first half, the Trump administration absolutely positively agrees with. On the second half, environmental standards, clean energy type agenda, I think that stuff is probably going to be, in many cases, thrown out.
Absolutely. And we need significantly more energy to build all of these data centers, right? I think the action there, we will see way more action there. And at least on my current read on the situation there, just whatever the administration can do is probably not enough. We eventually need Congress and others to act. We need some type of NEPA reform and more to get this energy permitting actually going. We talk about 500 billion, we talk about gigawatts of plans running these data centers. This is nothing,
yeah.
Right? This is nothing you can easily do with just saying we make federal permitting a bit easier. And I think actually the executive is limited to the degree what they can do there. I think they will be creative. I think they will have more leeway now if they care less about the climate impacts and environmental impacts of these kinds of things, but more needs to be done there.
Couldn't agree more. And even in talking with folks who were involved in writing the Biden administration's executive order on AI and energy, they said, this is the max that we can do as the executive branch without action for Congress. If you want to go harder than this, you pretty much have to involve Congress, as you said.
Yeah. And I think that's also an interesting aspect connecting again to the diffusion rule. If you cannot do it here, and they want to build elsewhere, where are we going to build, right? And maybe just practically speaking, if you just simply cannot stem it here, do you then just want to follow economic incentive and build in the UE or in the Middle East? Or do you want to partner up with, I don't know, Canada, Greenland, let's be creative here and build more data centers there and get the energy going there? And I think that's a thing one should seriously consider.
I hadn't heard partnering with Greenland before. That's an interesting take.
Which is notably tier 1 right now because it's part of Denmark as of now. And when it's part of the US, it's also tier 1, even easier.
Nice.
Well, it sounds like Stargate is going to be a really interesting case study to follow both the diffusion rule, the infrastructure energy build out, data centers being built here in the U.S. and the UAE's partnership and all of that. And I know we could talk about this topic for days, but let's move on to AGI. Another hot debate that's going on in the tech world, and something that we actually talked about last year on the podcast was whether AI scaling laws and a path to AGI may be slowing. But in the past week or so, CEOs of several major AI companies have come out strongly on one side of this debate. Greg, what have people been saying about our timeline on AGI?
I think, again, folks who took rest during the holiday season, good for them. However, a lot changed in December, and the messaging that is coming out of the technology ecosystem, at this point, it's pretty one-sided, right? So as somebody like me who's been deep in the weeds of AI policy for, the better part of a decade at this point, there's always been debate like, oh, maybe AGI is in 2050, maybe AGI is never, maybe AGI is 10 years away. And even last year, in early 2024, you would hear senior venture capitalists, senior AI researchers, senior executives at leading AI technology firms saying like, oh, maybe AGI is 10 years away or something like that, or maybe it's 5 years away, et cetera. There has been this remarkable coalescing around a narrative of AGI very, very soon. And that shift in messaging really has just been in the past few months. So in a blog post on January 5th, we had Sam Altman saying, quote, "We are now confident we know how to build AGI as we have traditionally understood it. We believe that in 2025, we may see the first AI agents join the workforce and materially change the output of companies." His competitor, Dario Amodei, in a recent interview at the Davos World Economic Forum this week, said, quote, "AGI has never been a well-defined term. For me, I've always thought of it as a marketing term. But, I think about it as at some point, we're going to get AI systems that are better than almost all humans at almost all tasks." And he said that that's going to happen in Trump's first term, in a handful of years tops. Similarly, Mark Zuckerberg, he said, quote, "Probably in 2025, we at Meta, as well as the other companies that are basically working on this, are going to have AI that can effectively be a sort of mid-level engineer that you have at your company that can write code." Alexander Wang said similar things. Elon Musk is saying similar things. I mean, basically, the leaders of the field are saying AGI very soon. In terms of, talking about like where we might see this first, I think it's noteworthy that Zuckerberg talks about coding and mid-level engineer as the sort of initial use case. And that's for a very, very good reason. Pardon me while I go on a tech digression here. But, there's different types of machine learning that are important in the construction of these integrated AI systems. And one of those really important types of AI is called reinforcement learning. And the lovely thing about reinforcement is the system sort of interacts with an external environment, whether that's a simulation or the real world. It sort of logs its experience in that external reaction. And then that data log of that experience is now the training data for the next update in the system. So reinforcement learning was one of the critical pillars underpinning the AlphaGo revolution of 2014, 2015, when DeepMind created a reinforcement learning-based deep learning system that defeated the world champion at Go. Well, the reason why it was able to do that is that the computer game Go is mathematically identical to the board game Go. So the system could play against itself, store the data of that game that it just played, and then use that as training data to create the next update of the system. So it gets better and better and better, plays against itself more and more and more, gets better and better and better, on in this sort of infinite loop of quality progression. So coding is kind of like that. I mean, it's not the simulated environment is very close to the real world environment. You can sort of say your intention, you can then generate the code, you can run the code, and then see if it did what you wanted it to do. So it is very amenable to reinforcement learning as an approach because you can generate synthetic training data. So when we say AGI, Dario Amodei's definition is this is an AI system that it can do most of the things that a human being can do. At least most of the things a human being can do when it's typing on a keyboard, clicking on a mouse, or speaking to a computer. Now, all of those tasks, I think, are going to fall at different rates. And I think in an incredible irony, the people who are sort of most at risk of being replaced by AI, in the near term at least, and I think it's coming for all of us sooner or later, but in the near term at least, it is people who are working with domains that are amenable to reinforcement learning. So it's not a surprise that coding is making all this revolutionary progress. It's not a surprise that math is seeing all of this revolutionary progress, because those are domains in which the simulator is a near equivalent representation of the real world. And so reinforcement learning is so good. And so that's another reason why folks, who are out there who are saying like, hey, I played around with ChatGPT in October and I played around with ChatGPT in January, and I'm not seeing all that much progress. Meanwhile, you have Silicon Valley, screaming their heads off about how much progress they've seen. It's like, well, are you a coder? Are you using ChatGPT to generate software? Because there we have seen an awful lot of progress. But just because that's the first to fall doesn't mean it's the last to fall. As I said, it's sort of coming for us all.
And it makes economically a lot of sense that these companies are going for this first, because what are they doing? They're doing AI research and development. They do coding, right? So if I'd be like running an AI company, well, hell yeah, that's the first thing, because that's how I get the flywheel spinning, right? Yeah. I do more AI and decoding. I help my engineers. Maybe eventually I'm going to automate them, but I won't tell them yet, right? But like that's just how do I make more progress on this over time.
Yeah. One other thing I think that's worth pointing out, and I think it was said very well by Noam Brown, who's a researcher at OpenAI. He actually just did a TED Talk recently talking about the sort of paradigm shift technically. And most of the progress driver that we've seen really since OpenAI announced O1 back in September has been on this scaling what is called test time compute. So you have the training run, which is using all of the AI to create the model. And then you have what is called the inference time computing, which is all the computing resources that are used to operate the AI model. And what's interesting is that now in the new series of models, O1, very importantly, O3, they're devoting more computing resources, giving the AI model more time to, quote, think about its answer before it answers. And Noam Brown, I thought the way he put it was really interesting. He said something to the effect of, I spent my entire PhD, like 5 years, chasing all these improvements in AI performance, and I worked on some important stuff, and everything I worked on, I think you could charitably say, delivered a 100x improvement in the performance of AI systems. And working on inference scaling of AI systems, we saw, in our first experiment on the topic, a 100,000x improvement in performance just by letting the AI model think for 20 seconds. And so this is why everybody is sort of losing their minds on AI is we've got this new approach to driving performance improvements, and we have barely even begun squeezing the first grapes, right, to make wine out of that new model. And this is related to what we were just talking about at Stargate. This new paradigm, shocker, it's going to be compute intensive. And that is why they're sort of saying this is the right moment to spend $100 billion on an asset that's going to depreciate over 3 years, and why we're willing to make that $100 billion investment, every year for the next 4 years. It's because they see we're close. We're close to AGI. Now is the sort of time to strike and get a really strong first mover advantage.
And notably, building these clusters, investing $500 billion, I think there was always like this single focus on like you build these big clusters, you train ever and bigger models, right? That's a paradigm we've seen before. And this paradigm might still be going, right? Like it might just be rerunning both paradigms at the same time now. We've generally seen bigger models have better chain of thought, right? If you're just like for your first response is smarter, so is your response if you have it a longer time smarter, right? So we see both of these things happening at the same time, and we now see these investments. Again, I think there was like at some point Sam Altman going around, we need this $7 trillion, right? And maybe it's like, well, is this for a single cluster? Like, I think it's actually way better to think about just like computers like this currency you need. You need it for pre-training, for like the initial training run. You need it for deployment if people eventually want to use it, right? How much compute you have determines how many AI agents you can use. It determines the size of your workforce, like literally. And it also determines like this thinking time, right? And what we generally see here, and I think what many speculate here, we saw O3, the most recent model from OpenAI, fairly shortly after O1. And I bet they used some thinking from O1 to train O3. So like it's interesting that we have like these dependencies, right? You start with this GPT-4 model. Out of this, you get O1. And out of O1, you do O3. This is kind of like how you get the flywheel spinning, right? There's like some contingency on these kinds of things. And for this, you might just have a data center which never talks to anybody outside the world. It's just a model talking to itself. And turns out it gets better, right? And I think that's like definitely development to pay attention to.
Yeah, I mean, it's that kind of recursive improvement that we talked about in the context of AlphaGo, right? It plays against itself in a game of Go, and it then uses that to update itself, and it gets smarter, and it plays against itself again. And we're seeing a similar version in the case of, how you use inference time computing to generate improved performance, what the new approach to training models is. I think one of the things that's really interesting on this synthetic data question is they're, just asking it the same question in 5 different ways and, scoring all of those answers. And so now you've sort of taken an existing data set and you've sort of magically multiplied it by 5 by doing very little effort as part of the training run. Now, Lennart, you said that we're still seeing improvements in the training run. Like we're still driving larger training runs and more improvements. And I want to ask you, Ilya Sutskever, who was formerly the chief scientist at OpenAI, has been a big, godfather of large language models. He sort of said the pre-training run scaling is over. So are you saying something different than him, or are you interpreting what he said differently?
Well, as an outsider, it's like kind of hard to speculate what exactly is going on there. But I think we haven't seen like massive, larger pre-trained model over the last year.
There is no GPT-5 yet.
They've trained. But like we saw O1. Who says there's not a bigger model in the background actually doing this, right? And then you like try to synthesize it. And with this inference time paradigm, it's more important to actually like distill these models and make them smaller, because each token you generate, you want to generate them as efficiently as possible. That's a general development we've seen. Many people don't need a 70 billion parameter model. They're okay with the 7B model, right? Where it's a little bit less intelligent, but it's cheaper. I can run on my local hardware. Well, the same thing OpenAI now has for the O1 and O3 model. If you look at the O3, well, I think the paper's not public yet, but I was like the testing. There was a low compute model and a high compute model, right? So we see this difference now. Notably, for example, many talked about, and you probably also covered it here, there was this ARC AGI test.
Yes,
and
we talked a lot about this.
It scored like 80% on it. Notably, it costed you $20,000 on computing time, like computing cost for scoring this, right? So we might see these really impressive capabilities, but they ain't be cheap. They ain't be cheap in the beginning. They will definitely get cheaper over time. But like O1 Pro right now doesn't cost you $20 like ChatGPT does. It costs you $200 per month. And I think Sam Altman actually stated they're losing money right now on it.
Yeah.
Like on this paradigm. So you see like still generating all this token costs you a lot of money doing this. And like there's the question like what is behind this? We only see the public facing model. How do you actually get this? How do you generate the synthetic data? And we will see over time. And we know that building their clusters in 100K size, right? Like for these kinds of things. So there's like something going on there, and we will see how this will develop. And I think this might be the next biggest capability jump we might be seeing. And also the capability jump, which then again sets the big AI companies apart from all the others, because this inference time paradigms, many low-hanging fruits, many people not going to this. They know what, like, new people will find something they even expect. Academics who didn't do a lot in AI over the last, at least not at the frontier, might be finding new things there. So, like, there will be, like, fairly low-hanging fruits. Many will be able to pick them. But if these companies get into these low-hanging fruits on the bigger models, that might be the interesting next development, where I expect, like, a bigger gap eventually to come.
Okay, well, let's move on to Chinese AI company DeepSeek. So on December 26, 2024, Chinese AI company DeepSeek released DeepSeek V3, an open source reasoning model. On January 20th, the company then released DeepSeek R1 based on V3. Before we get into why these models are so special, can you give some background about the company, Greg?
So DeepSeek, for those who haven't heard of it yet, it is unambiguously the leading frontier AI model developer in China. They are the ones doing the most interesting research. There's other cool stuff going on at Alibaba and some of its subsidiaries, but it's just worth pointing out that DeepSeek is now clearly the leader. And I've talked to folks at some of the leading AI firms, and they say, like, we read DeepSeek papers and we learn things. And it's just worth noting that they have a really interesting locus and density of high quality talent, and they're doing legitimately good work. One thing that's funny is, like, this came as a quantitative trading firm, High Flyer Capital Management. So the reason why they were buying GPUs before they got into the large language model development business is to like do hedge fund style market trading, like that kind of algorithm sort of thing. So even before the October 2022 export controls went into place, Highflyer had already bought 10,000 NVIDIA A100 chips, at least according to the reporting from the Financial Times. And, just by comparison, Meta has bought like 600,000 of, H100 and A100 type chips. At least it will have that many in hand by the end of the year. So a little bit of a gap in terms of capability there. But still, they've sort of been in the game for a while. Now, one thing I think is so interesting, this is, I think, going to come up in the course of this conversation, is that there's a DeepSeek advertisement that says, quote, "We believe AGI is the violent beauty of model times data times computing power. Embark on a deep quest with us on the journey towards AGI." So they've gone from hedge fund building machine learning models for quantitative trading to now they are all in on AGI, just like OpenAI, just like Anthropic, just like Google, just like Meta, et cetera, et cetera. So that is where this company is and where they're about. The V3 and R1 models, I do think, are really, really impressive technically. And what's interesting is, the techniques they're using, it's one that Lennart mentioned a moment ago, model distillation, which is you have a giant fancy model and it costs you a lot of data and a lot of computing resources to create that. But inside of that model, not all parts of the model are equivalently useful, right? So you've heard of the Pareto principle, which sort of says in any company, 20% of the people are doing 80% of the work. Well, there's a version of that that's true in a model, right? Where you have so many hundreds of billions of parameters, but which are the most important parameters? Which are the ones that are really getting you the most of the value? And model distillation is a way of subtracting from the model in a way that seeks to be optimal, right? How much can we shrink it without affecting performance all that much? And so this model distillation approach, which, is something that Anthropic has been doing, something that OpenAI has been doing for a while, but DeepSeek sort of cranked it up to 11. And they have now got they were able to train V3 using only, according to the Allen Institute for Artificial Intelligence, only $5.6 million of training resources. So we got to connect this back to what we just heard from Stargate, right? They're talking, we're going to spend $500 billion to build all this AI infrastructure, to train and inference all these AI models. And then there's this other world out there where a Chinese company is able to build an AI model that, at least on some benchmarks, is like comparable to what Meta is doing with Llama for a tiny, tiny fraction of that cost. Now, that's, again, not unknown to the frontier AI labs, right? I remember when GPT-2 came out, it was trained by a supercomputer. I can now run GPT-2 on my laptop. I remember when GPT-3 came out. I'm not sure if it could run on my laptop, but I wouldn't be surprised at this point. So there is this world in which we just keep getting better and better at distilling models. And so what is world-shapingly good 1 year can run on your laptop 3 to 5 years later. And DeepSeek is sort of showing that time dilation might be shrinking. We might be actually getting faster and faster at getting better and better models to run smaller and cheaper. And for folks who don't listen to the Stratechery podcast, there was a really good interview that Ben Thompson did with Nat Friedman and Daniel Gross, where they said, one of the dominant trends that appears to be going on in AI technology right now is smaller, faster, cheaper. And the question sort of becomes, well, who are the customers who can really justify laying out a lot of money for the absolute best performance? And who are the customers for which, this cheaper model, which is still pretty good, is going to be good enough? And all of that then raises the question, is Stargate crazy? Right? Are they getting ready to make a crazy, crazy investment at a time in which the future might be cheaper and smaller? And then secondarily, this is something Lennart and I and Brielle, we're going to have to get into. It's like, what does this mean for the export controls? Because if our theory of the universe was AI is computation intensive, we can stop China from getting enough computation to compete, plenty of folks in Washington, D.C. are asking me this question of, does this mean the export controls have failed? Like, has China discovered a new, more compute-light approach to AI that is actually going to be the dominant paradigm, as opposed to everything that we were betting on in ideas like Stargate and in ideas like the export control architecture?
All right. Well, Lennart, you are the more technical expert in the room here. Can you talk to us about what DeepSeek means on a technical level?
Sure. Happy to say more, but I'm still a technical expert in DC. So, the people in Silicon Valley might still have better things to say. Greg was already highlighting it. It's kind of impressive what they've pulled off, right? And I think that's we should really distinguish between DeepSeek version 3, which came out, and DeepSeek R1, which just came out a couple of days ago, but was announced actually 2 months before. So what Greg described is what I call an excess effect. So basically what it describes is you get the same capabilities for less compute. This has always been the case. The most prominent examples of this, we have this when we go back in the 2010s with ImageNet. It costed you $1,000 to train a system, which is really good at ImageNet. Now I can do it for a couple of cents. This is just the history of tech every single time. And I think what many people just underappreciate, it's exponentials. It's not you get 10% better. It's more this year it's just half the cost. And that's just what we've been seeing over time. So it's not about you can now deploy GPT-3 more cheaply on your laptop. You could just train a new model, which is way smaller, but as good as GPT-3. That's the excess effect we're seeing here. And I think many people focus on this because this is what the household consumer cares about, because now I can run on my laptop the model which was previously only accessible to OpenAI and the big companies. But I think what many people are missing here is the performance effect, which basically means, well, if you just keep your compute steady now, you get more juice out of it, right? But we're basically saying you get more juice out of each unit of compute. So you got two options. I use less compute and I get the same juice out of it. Or I use the same amount of compute and I get more juice out of it, right? And I think that's an important development we need to pay more attention to here. This means DeepSeek has all of these impressive compute efficiency improvements, or compute multipliers, if you want to call it this way.
Yeah. One way that I think about this is how many IQ points per NVIDIA GPU flop, computation do you get? So if DeepSeek has discovered this interesting new phenomenon of, a multiplier of IQ points for the AI model per flop of input computation, that's really interesting. But isn't that kind of also available to the West, which has way more compute?
Right. And notably, DeepSeek published the papers. We both read them. We have a lot of insights what they're doing. I have no clue what's going on at Anthropic, OpenAI, and DeepMind because they don't tell me.
Although it does sort of seem like that DeepSeek has a pretty good idea of what's going on at Anthropic, OpenAI, DeepMind.
Well, that's a question, right? It could just be the case that DeepSeek now found ways which the companies already found a year ago and they just didn't tell anyone, right? Because since the last few years, we've been entering this new paradigm. These companies all used to publish all of their papers where they said how they're doing it. Right now, we don't even know how big their clusters are, how much flop they use for training the system. So in the dark on these kinds of things. And I think this leads to some kind of imbalance where we just look at DeepSeek, it's wow, impressive. Well, because we know, right? That's just we see what they've been doing there. Notably, it could still be the case they just found new things which the leading labs in the US haven't found yet. And they can also now use it at the same time. So I think that's the thing to pay attention to there. But also, funnily enough, with V3, the model was accessible. Some people prompted and asked V3 hey, how you doing? What's your name, by the way? And sometimes we responded, hey, I'm ChatGPT.
Yeah.
Right?
So what model are you distilling here, guys? It sounds like maybe you found a way. And just to talk about how this might work, what is the training data set? Well, it's possible that one of the things that DeepSeek did is the training data set was asking ChatGPT questions and then, stealing all of that data and feeding it directly into the training data set for DeepSeek. In that case, right, DeepSeek gets all of the benefit of, not all, but a lot of the benefit of OpenAI's upfront, big investment, and then a sort of a mechanism for harvesting training data at a very efficient rate, because ChatGPT had to download the entire internet and then turn that into an AI model. Well, most of the internet is junk and not helpful for you in creating the model, but you don't know that. You don't know which parts are good. Well, but if you're DeepSeek and you're training off ChatGPT data, ChatGPT has already done all the hard work of trying to find which parts of the internet are actually useful as training data. And that's a really big challenge, if true, right? You have to ask yourself, what is the first mover advantage in AI right now? It could be the case, and I think China is desperately hoping that it is the case, that fast follower is a really nice place to be. And there's plenty of industries where fast followers do well. Meta, for example, right? They stopped inventing new stuff at Meta, at least in the social media paradigm, a long time ago. And they sort of waited for some other company to try out a feature like stories. That was when Meta saw that Snapchat was taking off. WhatsApp, that's a company, Meta bought, didn't innovate at home. And so there is this phenomenon where fast follower is a pretty good competitive position. And so I think DeepSeek sort of leads us to ask the question, like, are we going to spend $500 billion to get to the frontier so that China can find a way to copy our homework for pennies on the dollar? And that's a really important question to have a solid answer to. Lennart, I'm hoping you have the answer to this question.
Well, I don't have the answer, but I think just like you point to the right thing. Like, seems like catching up is easier, and I think we've over time now seen like this gap is actually like actually smaller than we might have thought. So like this might be an update. It's like, well, it turns out these models might not be the moat. And actually, if people pay close attention to like what's been happening in the AI ecosystem over the last year, XAI, well, from like the startup from Elon Musk, also kind of came out of nowhere, and their model was like leading in Chat Arena, which is like another benchmark which people really like to pay attention to, and I think this should have all updated us towards like, well, oh, wow, it turns out, okay, you need a big cluster, you need some engineers, and like turns out you have like a fairly competitive model, right? Despite OpenAI been doing this for 10 years. Mm-hmm. So it's not that secret.
I think like the core technical team of XAI for that big cluster, not every employee at the company, not every contractor at the company, but like the sort of core technical team, I think it was like 30 people. Yeah. So it's like 30 people plus like Elon Musk's indomitable will and time frame, when it comes to rapid construction. And a lot of money, 30 people plus, a rapid construction time frame plus a lot of money to buy a lot of chips. Boom, you're like pretty close to the state of the art in a relatively short period of time.
Right. And I think like the best example to think about is like when we think about the semiconductor industry. Well, it's way easier to catch up if you're in the first 10 years of a new industry and it's a semiconductor industry. But if we're 80 years down the pipe, I don't expect any startup tomorrow come out of nowhere and build ASML's EUV machines or like challenge TSMC. Right. Mm-hmm. Whereas like, well, we're like new in this AI thing. AI companies are a thing like what, 4 years? Are they even profitable right now? Like, is a question. So like, it's like way easier to catch up on these kinds of things. And the last thing to say on this, like, we like overly focusing on like benchmark performance. It would be nice if it would be about the world, like who has the best product, who has the best benchmark performance on these kinds of things.
Yeah.
There are many things which you can't measure in benchmarks, right? I think like ChatGPT, like the OpenAI models are often leading, but I personally prefer Anthropic Claude because I think just like got a better writing style, right? Many coders prefer this. And then the last thing, it doesn't matter if you have the best model, it depends how you deploy it, right? If you tomorrow are a company which Apple picks to deploy in every smartphone around the world, I claim you're a big winner. And this might be, they might pick you because you have the best model, but they might also pick you for many other reasons, right? And if you then do you want to pick the DeepSeek model, which has like questionable political opinions on some kinds of things, right? And that's like a thing we also got to pay attention to.
So I think it's worth, bringing in the voice of some of the other leaders in the AI sector and what they're saying about DeepSeek here. So I'm just going to read some quotes that I found pretty interesting. First, you got Andrej Karpathy, who has been one of the leading AI researchers, AI engineers. He was a founding team member at OpenAI. He said on X, quote, DeepSeek making it look easy with an open weights release of a frontier-grade LLM trained on a joke of a budget. 2,048 GPUs for 2 months. For reference, this level of capability is supposed to require clusters of close to 16,000 GPUs. Then you've got Satya Nadella, at the CEO of Microsoft. He said, quote, to see the DeepSeek new model, it's super impressive in terms of both how they have really effectively done an open source model that does this inference time compute and its supercompute efficiency. We should take the developments out of China very, very seriously. Then you've got Aravind Srinivas. Apologies if I got that name wrong, but he's the CEO of Perplexity AI. He said, quote, necessity is the mother of invention. Because they had to figure out workarounds, they actually ended up building something that has a lot more efficient. The workarounds, I should point out, that he's referring to are the export controls. And then finally, you've got Mark Andreessen, the venture capitalist who now is close to the Trump administration. He said on X, DeepSeek R1 is one of the most amazing and impressive breakthroughs I've ever seen. And as open source, a profound gift to the world, right? Mark Andreessen, by the way, big fan of open source everything. So this, I think we have to ask ourselves like the hard question, like what does this really mean for the future of export controls? What does this really mean for U.S.-China competition? I'm going to say my take here. First, this model was reportedly trained on NVIDIA H800 chips, right? For those who know about export controls, the H800 is the failure of the October 2022 export controls. So the October 2022 export controls had these technical benchmarks for what chips were allowed and what chips were not allowed. The sort of original hypothesis in the Biden administration was that, the best chip that NVIDIA had was the A100. We wanted China to not be able to buy that and to not be able to buy anything better than that, but instead to have to go back a generation or two and buy the old NVIDIA chips. What the Biden administration did not anticipate was that NVIDIA would be able to literally blow a fuse. That's all they had to do, was blow a fuse on the chip, modestly degrade the interconnect speed performance of the chip, and suddenly, on the exact same assembly line, China is able to buy leading edge chips, which I think had like a 10 to 15% performance degradation, not like the 50 to 75% performance degradation that we've had. So there's a lagging impact of export controls when you talk about the infrastructure build out. The DeepSeek revolution is occurring as the failure of those October 2022 export controls. We've revised the architecture in October 2023. We revised it again in December 2024. We revised it again in January 2025. And if that control architecture is going to work, we would only start feeling it later this year or the year after that. And I've said this before, but it's worth pointing out again. DeepSeek's CEO said, an explicit quote, the biggest challenge our company faces is these compute export controls. So we are sort of living in DeepSeek's golden era of the failure of the Biden 2022 export controls. What they see in the future is the pain of the 2023, the 2024, et cetera, export control. So I think that lagging impact is really important to note. The second thing is, we were just talking a moment ago about how DeepSeek has legitimately impressive architectural improvements, right? Even if a lot of this was trained by stealing training data off of ChatGPT, it doesn't matter. It does matter, but there's also legitimate technical innovation here, and anybody who reads that paper will identify that. The point, though, is that technical innovation is now available to the West, right? If DeepSeek has a new architectural improvement that gives you more IQ points per chip, well, we now steal that, and we have the same IQ points per chip multiplier, and we have way more chips, which is really, really nice. And then there's a third thing, which Anthropic CEO Dario Amodei has pointed out the exact same point. So I'd rather you hear it from him than from me. But let's say this. So he said recently in an interview, quote, "It's been reported that DeepSeek had something like 50,000 H100s. He's wrong. They were H800s, but let's keep going. But it's much less than the amount of chips that we or some of the other players are planning to build in the next year, which I think would go into the high hundreds of thousands. In 2026, probably into the millions, and in 2027 from different players, as we saw yesterday, potentially into the tens of millions of chips." So the point here is that the scaling that we are seeing in AI right now just keeps going up, and up. And the performance boost, as we talked about in this AGI part of the discussion, people see a clear runway for those extraordinarily high, 10x, 100x, 1000x multiples of computing power to deliver really, really extraordinary improvements in performance. And it's those next turns of the scaling law crank that are specifically the ones that DeepSeek is going to be cut off from. And there's one final point here, which is the model distillation part of the story. That's a tool that is, again, available to OpenAI and to Anthropic and to Google and so on, because what they can say is here's our super expensive version of the model, which costs so many dollars per token of usage, and then here's our distilled version of the model, which costs this much lower rate. I have heard rumors; these are unconfirmed rumors, but I've heard that O3 Mini is going to be free. Literally, just anybody, can use it on an unrestricted basis. I don't know if that's true, but if that is true, that's really, really interesting. So, right now, everybody's oh my gosh, DeepSeek is so cheap. I could run the lowest performing version of DeepSeek on my laptop. And I think the point sort of remains that Well, the big guys in the United States also had that same approach available to them to be cheap. But it's worth pointing out that DeepSeek did cause like a price war for large language model usage tokens in China. And I can't wait for the prices to drop here in the United States as well. I'm really looking forward to that. Lennart, I've been talking way too long. Am I wrong? Am I right? What do you think?
This all sounds about right to me. I think like just connecting like your previous points where you're saying like you build these clusters and you use these chips for at least for 3 years. This means if you like export controls only work for a little bit more than a year, you're still running on these old clusters you built like in this time, even before 2022 or before 2023.
Okay, I'm sorry to interrupt you when I just told you to please riff, but you just sparked something in me that I have to point out. When Gina Raimondo went to China and Huawei released the phone while she was there, that wasn't an accident, right? Like that was China, like literally, I've heard it from people who are in a position to know that the Chinese government ordered Huawei to time the release perfectly for while Raimondo was there because they wanted to send a message, export controls don't work, please give up. Well, why are we hearing about DeepSeek during Trump's first week of the presidency? What could it possibly be? They're trying to send a message that export controls don't work. But I have heard that, from Biden administration officials that in meetings between Joe Biden and Xi Jinping, like Xi Jinping spent 25% of the time saying that these export controls need to stop. They need to stop right now, right? He's not using 25% of that meeting to ask them to stop because he doesn't think they're working. He's asking them to stop because he thinks they are working. And DeepSeek is absolutely part of the Chinese government's messaging strategy to the United States industry, to the United States government, and it's a critical moment with this Trump point. It's very intentional. But here's the thing. The Huawei phone with Gina Raimondo was kind of a lie because it didn't prove anything about what U.S. export controls were doing because they built that phone using the machines that they bought before the export controls went into effect. In the exact same way, DeepSeek trained this model with the chips that they bought during the period when the export controls didn't work. And so I want to caution everybody in Washington, D.C. from sort of like looking at this very extraordinarily well-timed Chinese release of an AI model that is legitimately impressive and interpreting from that exactly the message that the Chinese government wants you to take away. When in fact, the true interpretation, I think, could be something quite different. Okay. Lennart, I'm sorry, I cut you off.
I couldn't agree more, right? And like just like connecting it like nicely to the Huawei like story with the phone and she's like, it's just fantastic. And like, I mean, part of the reason I'm here, like, we all read the news this morning, and like, it was like, export controls are not working, and I'm just like, texting, sending emails, I was like, oh gosh, like, man, God, that's like not the message which should come across here. It's like actually more complicated. And I hate to be the guy who's like, it's more complicated, but it is, right? That's just simply the case. So I generally got bad news for everyone who thinks export controls are gonna stop the Chinese ecosystem. They can't train X. I was like, that's not how they work. They just make things harder. They make things more costly. Right? They have to use all the chips. They have to use their own chips. They don't have enough chips. So the best way to think about it is just like, well, export controls limit the total amount of computation resources available there. How could this impact you? Well, how many companies do we have who have like really competitive model? Way more than China, to my understanding, right? So the US ecosystem can like sustain 5, 10, 100 different companies. They may be only 2 because they only have that much computation resources. Sure, like for some things, one company is enough, right? I'm not saying policy problem is solved here, just a good thing to understand. Secondly, who else doesn't matter? Talked about it before. They eventually all want to make money, right? We worried about national security concerns here, but if you think about workforce replacement, the amount of compute literally determines how many tokens you can run, how many AI agents you can run, and like how you can replace your economy.
This is such a great point, right? Because the amount of compute that it takes to publish a research paper and the amount of compute that it takes to be the dominant AI model provider to the customers of planet Earth, those are different amounts of compute.
Absolutely. And I think when we talk about the $500 billion for Stargate, well, I hope they want to make money at some point, right? So they got to deploy it, right? People are actually got to use it. And I will promise you, if everybody now starts using DeepSeek, they will have a GPU crunch. They simply cannot deploy the model that many instances, serve all of these users. Does this matter? Well, maybe it matters. It matters you make less money, therefore your next training run is smaller and you buy less GPUs, right? But I think it's important to understand right now we don't work in a paradigm where the size of your training run or like the capabilities of your AI models is determined by how much money you make. This is mostly VC funding. This is mostly people betting on these kinds of things. So we haven't seen this yet, right? And this might continue for while going on. So if we just have this narrow view of export controls and we only look at the benchmark capabilities of a single model, you will always see the smallest impact there. Yeah. That's just simply the case.
And one thing that you sparked in me that I think it's worth pointing out is the diffusion rule in particular. The model export restrictions are calibrated to open source, right? So if China creates an awesome model and makes it open source, or if Meta creates an awesome model and makes it open source, well, suddenly, any American company can put that anywhere in the world. I mean, not North Korea, but mostly anywhere in the world. So the point is the people who designed the export control architecture noted that okay, if we were to say, Americans can't sell AI above some level of performance, but surprise, China just open sourced that exact level of performance. Well, yeah, we recognize that would be a disaster for U.S. companies who want to, make money in Africa or make money in South America or whatever the case may be. But a lot of these export controls are sort of automatically self-updating. And one of the mechanisms by which they are self-updating is the sort of current state of the art in open source, which I think is worth pointing out.
Yeah, that's important to pay attention to. And I think another point here, just talking about this delay here, is we saw the current generation of models coming out these 10,000 GPU clusters, right? Or like thousands of GPU clusters, which is the current generation. Now they're building a bunch of clusters via Stargate. We know Elon Musk built a 100K cluster. We haven't seen these models being trained yet, right? And I touched upon previously, if pre-training, the scaling paradigm continues in parallel to the test time compute, and we will see the next big pre-trained model either being used as a base model or being used for distilling, then we will see a bigger gap emerging again. We just haven't entered this new era yet, right? So it's good to think about the different generations of data centers and if they will impact, right? So it's not it doesn't work, it does work. We just need to pay attention to the different paradigms here. I think it's totally fair to say the test time compute paradigm challenges a little bit AI capabilities per model, but in other ways, it hits way harder, right? And that's just an important thing to understand here. So binary yes and no is just complete wrong way.
Well, gentlemen, there's going to be a lot for us to keep watch of this year. One thing's for certain, 2025 is going to be a big year for AI advancement. I want to thank you for joining us today on the AI Policy Podcast. Exciting news for all of our listeners. We have a report dropping on the UAE-US collaboration on data center build-out. Coming today, actually co-authored by Lennart, Georgia Adamson, Greg Allen, and Sam Winter-Levy of the Carnegie Institute for Peace.
Yeah. This is the trip report from our research trip to the UAE, where we got to tour a lot of cool data centers, meet with a lot of interesting folks. And I think it's going to be a great paper, which everyone should read. And that's it.
All right. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the AI Policy Podcast. Be sure to subscribe on your favorite podcast platform so you never miss an episode. We also love to hear from you, so reach out at aipolicypodcast@csis.org with your suggestions and feedback. Finally, don't forget to visit our website, csis.org, for our latest research reports and events. This podcast was produced by Sarah Baker, Isaac Goldston, and Sadie McCullough. See you next time.